Most Christians fast for the wrong reason, and they never even realize it. They think fasting is about getting God's attention, about convincing Him, about proving something spiritual so that answers finally come. But what if fasting was never about changing God at all? What if the real mystery behind fasting is not pressure, but presence? Because somewhere along the way, many believers turned fasting into a transaction, a way to unlock breakthroughs, a method to force results. But in Scripture, fasting was never treated like a formula. It was always a posture, a surrender, a quiet return of the heart. Jesus said in Matthew 6:16, "When you fast, not if you fast." He assumed it would be part of a believer's life. But he also exposed something deeper, that you can fast outwardly and still remain far inwardly. That is where the danger begins, because you can skip meals and still be full of yourself. You can feel hunger in your body and still be distant in your spirit. You can fast and never actually draw near to God. So the question is not whether fasting works. The question is whether you understand what it is doing to you. The first truth is this: fasting reveals what you truly depend on. At first, fasting feels physical. Your body reacts quickly, hunger becomes loud, thoughts become sharp, even small things feel harder. And this is where most people misunderstand it. They think the hunger is the goal. But it is not. The hunger is only exposing something deeper, what has been silently sustaining you. Comfort, routine, distraction, control, emotional escape. When these are removed, something uncomfortable rises, not just weakness, but awareness. Awareness of how easily the flesh leads. Awareness of how quickly the mind clings. Awareness of what has been quietly ruling your attention. But here is what most believers miss. Fasting is not about starving the body to impress God. It is about silencing everything that competes with God's voice. And in that silence, something begins to shift. Not in heaven, but in you. The second truth is this: fasting exposes what competes with God's voice. When you continue fasting, something deeper happens. The noise inside you starts to surface. Thoughts you buried become louder, emotions you avoided become clearer, patterns you ignored become harder to escape. And this is the point many people quit. Because fasting does not just remove food, it removes distractions that were covering your inner condition. In Scripture, fasting was never just about asking God for things. It was about becoming sensitive again, becoming aware again, becoming spiritually awake again. But spiritually, something deeper is happening. God did not move away. You simply stopped noticing Him. And in that quiet space, you begin to realize what has been speaking louder than Him all along. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was control. Maybe it was unresolved anxiety. Fasting does not create God's presence. It clears your awareness of what was blocking it. And when that happens, the real confrontation begins, not with hunger, but with truth. The third truth is this: fasting is not escape, it is alignment. Many people enter fasting trying to escape something: pressure, delay, confusion, a situation they cannot control. But biblical fasting was never escape, it was alignment. When Esther called for a fast, it was not to avoid danger, it was to align a people with God's mercy. When Jesus fasted in the wilderness, it was not to run from identity, but to step fully into it. But here is what most believers miss: fasting does not change God's direction. It changes your ability to walk in it. Because when the flesh becomes quiet, the spirit becomes clearer. And what God was already speaking starts to become visible again. Decisions that felt heavy begin to simplify. Convictions that felt weak become strong again. Direction that felt hidden begins to emerge. Not because God shifted, but because you did. And that is where fasting begins to draw something deeper than answers. It draws clarity. It draws awareness. It draws truth into focus. And that awareness is often where transformation quietly begins. The mistake continues when people assume fasting is only about receiving something from God: a breakthrough, a door, a change in situation. But the deeper purpose of fasting is rarely about what you get. It is about what gets removed from you. Because sometimes the real blockage is not outside your life, it is inside your attention. The fourth truth is this: fasting removes spiritual noise so clarity can return. When you begin fasting seriously, something subtle happens first. Life does not suddenly become easier. In fact, your inner world often becomes louder before it becomes quiet. You start noticing things you ignored for months, thoughts you postponed come back stronger. Emotions you suppressed rise without warning, and this is where many misunderstand what is happening. They think fasting is making things worse, but actually it is revealing what was already there. For a long time, distraction was protecting you from awareness, but fasting removes that protection, and suddenly you are face to face with yourself again. But here is what most believers miss. God is not creating new problems in fasting. He is exposing old ones you never dealt with. This is why fasting often feels uncomfortable before it feels powerful, because clarity always begins as discomfort. And in that discomfort, God begins to redirect your attention, not through noise, but through quiet conviction. A scripture suddenly stands out differently. A prayer feels more personal. A small correction in your heart feels louder than before. Not because God changed his voice, but because you are finally hearing it without interference. And that leads to something even deeper. The fifth truth is this: fasting is not about forcing God closer, it is about removing distance within you. Many believers pray during fasting, asking God to come closer. But Scripture repeatedly shows something different. God is already near. The distance is not on his side. It is created in moments where life becomes louder than devotion: busyness, anxiety, habit, emotional dependence. These things do not push God away, but they pull your awareness away from him. And fasting begins to reverse that direction, slowly, quietly, without drama. Your attention shifts back. Your sensitivity returns. Your inner life starts to recenter, and what once felt distant begins to feel familiar again. But here is the deeper revelation. You don't find God in fasting as if he was missing. You rediscover him because you finally stopped running from awareness, and that changes everything. Because now prayer is not routine, it becomes conversation again. Scripture is not obligation, it becomes direction again. Silence is not emptiness, it becomes encounter again. And this is where fasting reaches its true purpose. Not hunger, not pressure, not performance, but return. A return of attention, a return of sensitivity, a return of alignment with what was always there. And when that happens, fasting stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like clarity. Then the final truth begins to settle in. The sixth truth is this: fasting does not change God's willingness, it changes your awareness of his nearness. This is where many believers misunderstand the entire purpose of fasting. They think God moves closer when they fast more intensely, that he becomes more available because of effort, discipline, or sacrifice. But Scripture never presents God as distant and then activated by hunger. Instead, it shows a God who is already near, already attentive, already present, but often unperceived. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. James 4:8 is not describing distance being physically closed. It is describing awareness being restored. Because the problem was never that God left. It was that attention drifted, and fasting becomes the quiet correction of that drift. Not through emotion, not through performance, but through removal. Removal of noise, removal of excess, removal of everything that constantly competes for inner space. And when those things begin to fall away, something unexpected happens. You start noticing God in places you overlooked before, not only in prayer, but in silence, not only in worship, but in conviction, not only in moments of strength, but even in your weakness. But here is what most believers miss. Fasting does not introduce God into your life. It exposes how present he already was while you were distracted, and that realization changes the way you walk forward. Because now, prayer is no longer a ritual you complete. It becomes a place you return to. Scripture is no longer information you read. It becomes a voice you recognize. And obedience is no longer pressure. It becomes response. This is why fasting often leads to something deeper than answers. It leads to alignment that feels quiet but steady, a recalibration of desires, a soft correction of direction, a return to simplicity with God. Not dramatic, not loud, but deeply transformative. And when you finally see it clearly, you realize something powerful. Fasting was never about convincing God to move. It was about removing everything that kept you from noticing he already had. So if you have been fasting only to receive something, you may have been missing what was already being given. Presence, clarity, conviction, direction, not far away, but near. And once that awareness returns, the way you pray will never feel the same again. Because you are no longer trying to reach God, you are learning to remain aware of Him. And that is where fasting truly ends, not in hunger, but in nearness. If this message spoke to you, comment, "Lord, make me aware." Share this message with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more biblical encouragement. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next one.